It was a quiet Sunday morning in the upscale Los Angeles neighborhood that had long been home to Hollywood royalty. The kind of place where the streets are lined with immaculately trimmed hedges, expensive SUVs glide silently past, and the scent of freshly baked pastries drifts from artisanal bakeries. But on this day, the serenity was shattered in a way no one could have predicted. Behind the gates of one of the city's most admired homes, a tragedy had unfolded that would shock the entertainment world and leave millions asking a single, haunting question. How could a family as seemingly perfect as the Reiners be destroyed from within? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob Reiner, the man who brought audiences classics like This Is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, Misery, and A Few Good Men, was gone. And with him, Michelle Singer Reiner, his devoted wife. Both were found dead under circumstances that would soon ignite headlines across the globe, painting a scene of tragedy, betrayal, and heartbreak. For decades, Rob had been celebrated not just as a director and actor, but as a cultural icon. A man who could make people laugh, cry, and think with equal mastery. His films had become part of the fabric of American storytelling, shaping the imaginations of generations. And yet, on this day, his life, which seemed so full of creativity, warmth, and accomplishment, came to a horrifying end. The first responders were met with a scene that seemed ripped from the plot of a psychological thriller rather than reality. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, no screams, no signs of struggle. The lawn was immaculate, the pool shimmering under the Californian sun, and yet inside, something unthinkable had occurred. Within hours, the quiet, sunlit street would become the epicenter of one of the most shocking criminal cases Hollywood had ever seen. But what was truly unimaginable, and what would dominate headlines for weeks to come, was the identity of the person who had been taken into custody. Nick Reiner, the son of Rob and Michelle. The arrest sent shockwaves across social media, news outlets, and Hollywood circles. How could this happen? How could a son turn on his own parents, the very people who had nurtured him, celebrated his milestones, and provided him with everything he could ever want? Questions like these didn't just linger, they demanded answers. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, as lawyers prepared their arguments, and as reporters scrambled for details, the world watched, horrified and fascinated in equal measure. And then came the public commentary, the kind that added fuel to an already raging fire. Former President Donald Trump, in a tweet that would make headlines, speculated, without evidence, that the deaths were somehow linked to Rob Reiner's public political stances. He suggested, in no uncertain terms, that the director's outspoken criticism had caused anger that ultimately led to this tragedy. The audacity of it was almost surreal. Here was a man who had spent his life entertaining millions, whose films had left a lasting cultural imprint, now being dragged into a political narrative about blame and derangement, all while his family was grieving in unimaginable silence. The world seemed to hang in suspended disbelief, unable to process both the loss and the surrounding chaos. But let's step back for a moment. Rob Reiner was more than headlines. He was a man whose career had spanned decades, a man who had transformed Hollywood comedy, drama, and satire with an unparalleled touch. From the biting humor of This Is Spinal Tap to the heartfelt innocence of Stand By Me, he created worlds that people inhabited, characters they remembered, lines they quoted for decades. Who could have imagined that such a creative force would be enveloped in personal tragedy, caught in a storm of mystery and heartbreak, so intense it rivaled any story he had ever told on screen? And Michelle Reiner? She was no mere accessory to Hollywood fame. A formidable woman in her own right, Michelle's influence on Rob's life and career had been profound. She had been his partner, confidant, and co-architect of a family life that, to outsiders, seemed enviable. Together, they were a portrait of success and stability, a Hollywood couple who had weathered the industry's highs and lows with poise and grace. Their deaths, therefore, were not just personal losses, they were the obliteration of an image, a narrative, a seemingly untouchable legacy. Yet within this perfect image, cracks had been forming for years, unseen by the public eye. Nick Reiner, the only child, had lived a life that some might describe as privileged, yet complicated. Stories began to surface, some whispered, some documented, of tension, financial disputes, and emotional distance between father and son. Friends described Nick as someone struggling to find his own identity in the shadow of a towering father figure. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared the world for the revelation that he had been arrested, accused of ending the very lives that had shaped him. The paradox of love and betrayal, nurture and destruction, became the central question haunting every news segment, tweet, and online discussion. As the story unfolded, the public learned more about the house where tragedy struck. A luxury estate, equipped with the finest amenities, designed for comfort and privacy, became the stage for an unimaginable event. Every detail was scrutinized: neighbors' statements, security footage, timelines, and even the smallest inconsistencies in witness reports. Each fact seemed to add layers to a narrative that was already unfathomable. And yet, despite the shock, people couldn't look away. The allure of a Hollywood family torn apart from within was irresistible. There was suspense, mystery, and drama all wrapped in the context of fame and fortune. But here's the thing. The story wasn't just about the crime. It was about the ripple effects, the emotional aftermath, and the shocking societal reactions. Hollywood reacted with disbelief, mourning one of its most respected figures while grappling with the reality that the murderer might not be a stranger but a son. Friends, colleagues, and even casual fans were left to reconcile the duality of Rob Reiner's life, the celebrated filmmaker versus the private family tragedy. And in the background, political figures and pundits added a layer of chaos, turning grief into controversy and sorrow into public spectacle. Then there were the legal proceedings, which began almost immediately after Nick's arrest. Lawyers prepared for a case that would be closely watched, dissected, and debated by millions. Courtroom dramas unfolded in real time, with details leaking to the press, each revelation more shocking than the last. Allegations, confessions, and courtroom strategies created a narrative that felt almost scripted, yet every word spoken, every tear shed, was real. The public was now part of the story, drawn into a narrative that mixed elements of family betrayal, criminal psychology, and celebrity culture. And as the days passed, the mystery deepened. Investigators hinted at underlying motives, some mundane, some shocking. Financial disputes, familial tensions, and long-standing resentments were explored. The more the world learned, the more questions emerged. Could anyone truly understand what had driven Nick to commit such an unspeakable act? What forces, psychological, emotional, and perhaps even environmental, had converged to lead to this day? The answers were fragmented, leaving the public to fill in the blanks with speculation, fear, and curiosity. By now, headlines were everywhere. News anchors spoke of the Reiners in hushed tones, social media buzzed with theories, and every detail was analyzed for hidden meaning. The combination of fame, scandal, and shocking violence created a perfect storm for mass fascination. Every new revelation was a spark, igniting debates, opinions, and sometimes outrage. The world was captivated, horrified, and grieving simultaneously, and the story was far from over. But the most shocking revelations were still to come. Details that would transform public understanding of the case, that would cast shadows on the Reiner legacy, and force society to grapple with uncomfortable truths about family, privilege, and the human psyche, had yet to emerge. What Nick confessed in court, the motivations behind his actions, and the responses of the people closest to the family would leave viewers questioning everything they thought they knew. And so, we stand at the threshold of a story that is as compelling as it is tragic, as shocking as it is heartbreaking. A story where fame cannot shield from sorrow, where love and betrayal collide, and where the world must confront the unthinkable reality that sometimes the monsters in our stories are not fictional. They are real, living within the very families we admire most. When you think of Hollywood legends, certain names automatically come to mind. Rob Reiner is one of them, a man whose films have become part of the cultural DNA of multiple generations. Reiner wasn't just a director. He was a storyteller, a cultural architect, a master of balancing humor, heartbreak, and humanity on screen. From the satirical genius of This Is Spinal Tap to the timeless charm of When Harry Met Sally, his work has been praised for its wit, emotional depth, and uncanny ability to capture the human experience. But beyond the accolades, awards, and iconic movie lines, there was a life, a family, a son, a marriage that seemed, to the outside world, untouchable. Until it wasn't. The story of Rob Reiner's legacy begins long before the tragedy that would shock the world. Born into Hollywood royalty himself, son of the legendary comedian Carl Reiner, Rob inherited not just a name, but a tradition of excellence, wit, and public scrutiny. Growing up, he was surrounded by the trappings of show business, laughter echoing through studio sets, creative energy pulsating in every corner of the house, and an expectation, silent but powerful, that he would carve his own place in the entertainment world. He did not disappoint. He became an actor, earning recognition with roles that demonstrated both comedic timing and dramatic range. Yet, it was behind the camera where his true genius would shine. Directing became Reiner's domain, a playground where he could manipulate narrative, tone, and emotion with the skill of a master craftsman. Films like Stand By Me revealed his ability to explore youth, friendship, and loss with a sensitivity that resonated deeply with audiences. Misery showed his command of tension and psychological horror, while A Few Good Men tackled morality, justice, and human integrity with cinematic precision. Each film contributed to a tapestry that was uniquely Reiner, simultaneously entertaining, thought-provoking, and emotionally compelling. He didn't just make movies. He made cultural touchstones, films that would echo through decades, quoted in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms alike. But while the world marveled at his professional achievements, there was another side to Rob Reiner, the personal side, the side that would now be forever overshadowed by tragedy. Rob married Michelle Singer, a woman described by friends and colleagues as intelligent, graceful, and fiercely devoted. Michelle was more than a spouse. She was a partner in navigating the complexities of Hollywood fame, a stabilizing force in a world of chaos, and a co-pilot in the family journey that included raising a son, Nick Reiner. Together, they cultivated a life that appeared idyllic: success, stability, and a household filled with creativity, warmth, and laughter. Neighbors often described the Reiners as the perfect Hollywood family. Their home, located in one of Los Angeles's most desirable neighborhoods, reflected their taste and attention to detail. Art-lined walls, manicured gardens, a home that could have been photographed for any lifestyle magazine. Yet, as any psychologist, counselor, or seasoned detective might tell you, appearances can be deceiving. Even the most polished families harbor secrets, tensions, and unspoken conflicts. The Reiners, it seems, were no exception. To the public, the image was flawless. Behind the closed doors, however, the reality was far more complicated. Fans knew Rob Reiner as a friendly, approachable, almost avuncular figure, often seen in interviews joking, smiling, and sharing stories of his Hollywood experiences. Yet, those closest to him hint at the intense, perfectionist streak that had driven his professional success. He demanded excellence, from himself, from his collaborators, and, at times, from those he loved most. That intensity could inspire greatness, but it also created friction. Longtime collaborators recalled moments of frustration on set, heated debates over artistic choices, and Reiner's uncompromising vision. These same traits, while beneficial for filmmaking, could complicate personal relationships, particularly within his own family. Michelle Singer Reiner, in turn, was known for her ability to navigate these waters with tact, patience, and quiet strength. Friends described her as the anchor of the household, a woman who managed to balance the demands of a high-profile marriage, the upbringing of a son, and a social life connected to Hollywood elite circles. She was not a background figure. She actively participated in charitable work, social events, and even in shaping decisions regarding Rob's career. The couple, on the surface, represented a union of brains, charm, and influence, a Hollywood power couple. And yet, even power couples have vulnerabilities, especially when the pressures of fame, wealth, and public expectation converge with the complexities of human emotion. Then there was Nick Reiner, the only child, whose presence loomed large in both the family narrative and, tragically, in the events that would follow. Nick grew up in an environment where success was expected and mistakes carried weight. While many children of Hollywood elites face public scrutiny, Nick's life was particularly intense. His father's reputation, both as a filmmaker and as the son of a comedy legend, created a unique pressure cooker environment. Friends describe him as talented, charismatic, yet complicated, someone striving to define his own identity amid the shadows of his father's fame. Like any teenager or young adult navigating family expectations, there were moments of rebellion, tension, and disagreement. What would have been typical family struggles became amplified under the glare of celebrity. Rob Reiner's films often explored themes of morality, loyalty, and human imperfection. Ironically, the man who examined the complexities of human relationships on screen was now living a drama that could have been scripted for the silver screen, though far darker than any fictional story. The dichotomy between his professional brilliance and the unraveling of his personal life is striking. Could fame, wealth, and influence shield one from tragedy? This question, once abstract, became painfully tangible. The Reiners were celebrated for their success, admired for their composure, and envied for their lifestyle. Yet in one shocking morning, all of that veneer would be stripped away, revealing raw human vulnerability. Hollywood, as a community, reacts to fame and scandal with an intensity unmatched elsewhere. When news broke of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths, the ripple effect was immediate and profound. Colleagues, fans, and industry insiders struggled to reconcile the image of the man who brought laughter, love, and reflection to millions with the grim reality now dominating headlines. Tweets poured in from actors, directors, and writers. Messages of disbelief and sorrow filled social media. Yet intertwined with grief was confusion, speculation, and in some cases, morbid fascination. The combination of a prominent family, violent tragedy, and criminal investigation created a perfect storm for public attention, a storm that was only beginning. What truly made this story arresting was the involvement of Nick Reiner. Here was a son, the child of two people whose lives had been dedicated to nurturing, guiding, and supporting him, now at the center of a criminal investigation so serious it would dominate national headlines. How does one even begin to understand the psychological, emotional, and relational dynamics that could lead to such a moment? Experts in psychology and family dynamics would later analyze the case, seeking patterns, motives, and warning signs, but the initial shock was immediate and raw. Questions proliferated. Had there been warning signs? Was this an impulsive act or the culmination of years of tension? How could such a tragedy occur in a household that outwardly seemed perfect? Yet, even as shock and grief dominated the narrative, there remained the professional legacy of Rob Reiner, a legacy that had influenced generations of filmmakers, writers, and performers. The paradox was stark. The man whose imagination had created some of the most beloved cinematic stories in modern history now had his life story consumed by a tragedy more harrowing than anything he could have scripted. For many, this added a layer of irony, so profound it was almost surreal. Reiner, a master of storytelling, had become the protagonist of a narrative marked by betrayal, familial collapse, and untimely death. And so, the Reiner legacy is a story of contrasts, brilliance and tragedy, admiration and horror, love and betrayal. It is a reminder that no amount of fame, no accumulation of awards, and no public adoration can insulate a family from heartbreak. The lessons here are bitter, complex, and compelling. They reveal the fragility of human relationships, the pressures of expectation, and the devastating consequences when tensions remain unresolved. The public may remember Rob Reiner for his films, his humor, and his creativity, but the world will now also remember the darker shadow that fell over his family, a shadow cast by one who should have been closest, most loyal, and most loving. But as the world mourned, as headlines blared, and as speculation ran rampant, investigators continued their work behind closed doors. Evidence was being collected, timelines reconstructed, and motives scrutinized. Every detail mattered, and every revelation added another layer to a story that seemed to defy comprehension. Friends, Neighbors and industry insiders began to speak, cautiously at first, then more openly, shedding light on a family life that had been, until that point, shrouded in privacy. And slowly, the pieces began to come together. Pieces that would reveal a narrative far more shocking, complicated, and devastating than anyone could have imagined. Because what happened in the Reiner household wasn't just a private tragedy. It was a story with public consequences, one that would challenge our understanding of family, fame, and the human capacity for betrayal. In the next chapter, the story of Nick Reiner, the son at the center of this storm, was about to take us even deeper into the heart of this unimaginable drama. Nick Reiner. Just saying the name might feel harmless, even ordinary, but in the context of the Reiner family tragedy, it is anything but. He is the son of one of Hollywood's most respected directors, Rob Reiner, and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner. To the public, he was simply the child of fame and privilege, living in a world of opportunity, wealth, and social status. Yet, as the shocking events unfolded, it became clear that Nick's life was far from ordinary and far from what anyone expected. From the start, Nick's life was framed by the towering presence of his father. Growing up in the shadow of a legendary filmmaker and comedy icon is no small thing. Carl Reiner, his grandfather, had set the bar high with decades of influence and entertainment accomplishments, and Rob Reiner continued that legacy with films that touched hearts and inspired audiences. For Nick, the expectation was subtle but ever-present. Succeed, live up to the family name, and navigate the pressures of public scrutiny. For some, these circumstances can fuel ambition, creativity, and resilience. For others, they can create intense pressure, frustration, and, eventually, resentment. As a child, Nick was reportedly intelligent, curious, and creative. Friends described him as witty, engaging, and capable of charm that could light up a room. Yet alongside these positive traits, early observers noticed a streak of defiance. A desire to forge his own identity, separate from the shadow of his famous father. This is a common challenge for children of celebrities, but in Nick's case, the conflict would take on deeper and more dangerous dimensions. Small disagreements with his parents evolved over time into significant tensions. The precise details are murky, but sources hint at clashes over expectations, lifestyle choices, and perceived limitations placed on him by the family dynamic. Financial pressures, ironically, were part of the equation as well. Despite the family's wealth, reports indicate there were disputes over money, allowances, and access to certain assets. In families with substantial resources, conflicts of this nature can seem trivial on the surface, but combined with emotional strain, they can fester into serious resentment. Friends and insiders describe a son who felt misunderstood, underappreciated, and increasingly disconnected from the very people who had given him everything. This disconnection, though invisible to outsiders, set the stage for a breakdown in family relationships that would have devastating consequences. Compounding these tensions was Nick's social environment. Friends from his teen years and young adulthood describe him as charismatic and sociable, but also impulsive, unpredictable, and sometimes volatile. In interviews, acquaintances hinted at mood swings, moments of rebellion, and occasional risky behavior. These were not wild, dangerous acts in the traditional sense. They were the hallmarks of a young man struggling to define himself, but they provide important context. When you combine emotional volatility with familial tension and public pressure, you create a scenario ripe for escalation. As Nick entered adulthood, these struggles intensified. The pressures of celebrity life, personal ambition, and strained family relationships collided. Some insiders claim that attempts at intervention, therapists, family discussions, and even private mediation were either ignored or ineffective. While we may never know the intimate details of these interventions, the results are painfully clear. A relationship between father and son, and between mother and son, that deteriorated over time, leaving resentment, anger, and unspoken grievances to accumulate like an unseen storm cloud. But Nick was not just a troubled son in private. He was increasingly visible in public. His social media presence, though limited compared to his father's fame, hinted at personal struggles, frustrations, and, at times, controversial opinions. While some posts were innocuous, Others suggested a growing discontent with life, family, or expectations. Observers began to notice contradictions, a life of privilege juxtaposed with expressions of isolation and frustration. It is within these contradictions that the seeds of tragedy often grow. The dissonance between external reality and internal perception creating a pressure cooker situation, one that can lead to irrational, destructive decisions. Perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of Nick's life story is how invisible these tensions seem to outsiders. To friends, colleagues, and fans, the Reiners were the epitome of Hollywood success. The public never saw arguments behind closed doors, subtle expressions of disappointment, or the simmering resentment that had built over years. The facade of a happy, accomplished family remained intact even as the underlying dynamics deteriorated. And that is often the most dangerous part. When warning signs are hidden behind appearances, the eventual eruption can be catastrophic. By the time Nick reached his mid-20s, those tensions had reached a critical point. Reports suggest that the relationship with his father was strained over both personal and financial matters. The Reiners' home, which had been a symbol of stability, became a crucible for conflict. Nick's actions, words, and choices increasingly clashed with his parents' expectations, creating a cycle of tension and retaliation. While we cannot know every detail of these private moments, the public record, the arrest, the investigation, and the court proceedings paints a stark picture of a young man trapped by circumstance, emotion, and perhaps an inability to manage anger and resentment. And then came the fateful day, a morning like any other, sun streaming over the manicured lawns, neighbors going about their routines, the city unaware of the horror unfolding behind closed doors. In a single moment, all the tension, frustration, and unresolved conflict erupted into tragedy. Rob and Michelle Reiner were found dead in their home. The details of the scene, which police have been carefully reconstructing, remain shocking and deeply unsettling. It was a crime that would dominate headlines not just because of its brutality, but because of who the accused was, the very person entrusted with their care, love, and trust. Nick's arrest was swift, leaving the world stunned. How could the son of such a revered family commit such an act? In the hours and days that followed, social media exploded with speculation, from disbelief to condemnation to empathy. Some tried to rationalize the unthinkable, citing possible mental health struggles or family conflict. Others focused on the apparent betrayal, framing Nick as a cautionary tale about entitlement, rage, and the dangers of unresolved family dynamics. But regardless of perspective, the story was now unavoidable, and Nick's life, until that point seen through a lens of potential and privilege, had been defined by tragedy. What makes this chapter even more compelling and chilling is the interplay of motive, opportunity, and consequence. Investigators uncovered a series of interactions in the days and weeks leading up to the deaths that suggested premeditation, disputes, and unresolved anger. Every detail, from text messages to witness accounts, began to reveal a complex psychological portrait, a young man struggling with identity, emotion, and morality, ultimately making choices that would end lives and alter history. The story of Nick Reiner is not simply one of crime. It is a psychological case study in familial tension, the pressure of public expectation, and the dark consequences of unresolved resentment. Yet even in the midst of this horror, there is nuance. Nick was not simply a villain. He was a human being shaped by circumstance, inheritance, and environment. Experts point out that children of highly successful parents often struggle with autonomy, self-worth, and internalized expectations. In Nick's case, these pressures, compounded by possible mental health issues and escalating conflict, created a perfect storm. The tragedy is multi-layered. It is about crime, yes, but also about human psychology, family dynamics, and the ways in which unresolved tension can metastasize into catastrophic outcomes. And while investigators, lawyers, and the media dissected the events, the public grappled with their own reactions. The story was impossible to ignore, compelling audiences to consider uncomfortable questions. How well do we know the people closest to us? Can privilege and opportunity protect against tragedy? And perhaps most hauntingly, what signs did we miss that could have prevented this outcome? These questions hung in the air like a cloud over the Reiner legacy, challenging perceptions of family, success, and morality. As Nick faced interrogation and legal proceedings, the complexity of his character began to emerge. He was, in some ways, a product of his environment. Intelligent, capable, yet conflicted, raised in luxury, yet struggling with emotion and identity, loved, yet harboring deep-seated grievances. Understanding him does not excuse his actions, but it illuminates the human factors that contributed to the disaster. It is within this tension between comprehension and condemnation that the story's dramatic power lies. Nick Reiner's life, until that pivotal day, had been a mixture of potential, conflict, and privilege. It was a life that could have gone in countless directions. Yet all of those possibilities converged into a singular, tragic event. One that would define his legacy forever and alter the lives of countless others. The story of the troubled son is a reminder that family dynamics, no matter how seemingly perfect, can hide deep fractures. That fame, wealth, and opportunity cannot shield anyone from the consequences of anger, resentment, or unresolved conflict. It was a morning like any other in the otherwise serene Los Angeles neighborhood where the Reiners had built their life. Sunlight spilled across manicured lawns, birds chirped in the meticulously landscaped gardens, and the city hummed its familiar rhythm of ambition, traffic, and endless opportunity. Yet, behind the gates of the Reiner estate, a storm had been silently brewing, a storm that would explode in a single, unimaginable act. By the time neighbors would call the authorities, the world would realize that the household of Hollywood royalty had become the epicenter of a tragedy so profound, so shocking, that it would dominate headlines, social media feeds, and dinner table conversations across the nation. The first hints that something was wrong were subtle. Neighbors reported noticing unusual stillness around the property, doors that were usually open in the morning now firmly shut. A quiet that felt heavier than ordinary. In a neighborhood where privacy was paramount, even minor deviations caught attention. But it wasn't until the emergency calls came that the enormity of the situation became clear. Police and paramedics arrived at the Reiner home to a scene that would haunt investigators and witnesses alike for years. The details, still under review in some quarters, painted a grim picture. The legendary director and his wife, Rob and Michelle Reiner, found dead in their home, victims of an apparent homicide. The chaos that followed was immediate and all-consuming. News crews descended on the neighborhood, their cameras capturing aerial shots of the quiet streets, the sprawling estate, and the flashing lights of police vehicles. Reporters scrambled to relay any verified details, piecing together fragmented accounts from neighbors, friends, and law enforcement officials. Every statement, every observation, every snippet of information became part of the puzzle that the public eagerly attempted to solve. And the most shocking piece of all, the piece that would redefine the narrative, was the identity of the suspect. Nick Reiner, the Reiners' only son. Imagine the disbelief. A young man, son of two people who had seemingly given him everything, now in custody for the deaths of his parents. The emotional impact rippled far beyond the confines of the estate. For neighbors, it was an unfathomable betrayal of trust. For friends, an incomprehensible act of violence. For the wider public, a story that seemed torn from the pages of a Hollywood thriller rather than real life. Yet, as investigators worked tirelessly, they began to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to this catastrophic morning. Authorities were cautious but thorough. Every corner of the home was examined, every object scrutinized, and every witness interviewed. Security footage, phone records, and personal accounts were collected to establish a timeline. From these details, a story began to emerge, one of escalating tension, private confrontations, and the tragic culmination of years of unresolved conflict. While the exact timeline remains sensitive, the overarching narrative is clear. The Reiner household, a symbol of stability and creativity, became the stage for an unthinkable act that would shatter the family and captivate the world. As details surfaced, the public learned more about the dynamics inside the home. Rob and Michelle were known to have had discussions, sometimes heated, with Nick in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Sources suggest disputes over financial matters, personal decisions, and family expectations. While such disagreements are common in any household, the intensity and secrecy within this family created a pressure cooker environment. The Reiners were not immune to the same challenges that affect ordinary families, but their wealth, fame, and public profile magnified every consequence, every tension, every mistake. Neighbors recalled the morning of the tragedy vividly. One described the silence as eerily complete, a stark contrast to the usual energy of a busy Hollywood household. Another noticed police cars and the sudden presence of emergency personnel, realizing immediately that something extraordinary and terrible had occurred. Witnesses struggled to reconcile the idyllic surroundings with the horror unfolding within the walls of the estate. The juxtaposition was jarring. The pristine gardens, the luxury cars, the carefully maintained home, all set against the backdrop of a devastating, violent event that would dominate public consciousness. Then came the arrest. Nick Reiner was taken into custody, his hands restrained, his face a mixture of disbelief, defiance, and something unidentifiable. The images circulated quickly across news networks and social media platforms. People paused mid-scroll, unable to comprehend the scene. How could this happen? How could a son, raised in comfort, privilege, and love, commit such an unthinkable act? The questions were relentless, dominating conversations and driving an endless cycle of speculation, analysis, and grief. Law enforcement carefully managed the situation, aware of the media frenzy and the public scrutiny. Statements were released cautiously, confirming only what was known with certainty. Rob and Michelle Reiner were dead, and their son had been taken into custody in connection with the deaths. Beyond that, authorities urged patience, emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing and that details would emerge as evidence was processed. But in the age of instant information, patience was scarce. Every unverified report, every rumor, every social media post became part of the narrative, complicating the investigation and intensifying public fascination. The psychological impact on neighbors and the local community cannot be overstated. Many had long admired the Reiners, associating the family with creativity, generosity, and sophistication. To witness such a violent rupture within this seemingly perfect household was to confront the fragility of human relationships, no matter how polished they appear from the outside. Community members described feelings of shock, sorrow, and disbelief, with some even expressing guilt for having perceived the Reiners' life as flawless. The tragedy forced everyone around them to reevaluate assumptions about family, success, and the hidden struggles that can exist behind closed doors. Media coverage amplified the story in ways both expected and unprecedented. News outlets across the country reported on the case, providing analysis, interviews, and expert commentary. Pundits debated potential motives, psychologists speculated on the mental state of the accused, and crime analysts dissected the timeline of events. The story transcended ordinary reporting. It became a cultural event, a case study in fame, family, and tragedy. Every new detail, whether confirmed or rumored, added to the narrative, deepening public intrigue and maintaining high engagement. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the day of horror was the contrast between perception and reality. To the outside world, the Reiners had lived a life of creativity, comfort, and influence. The public adored Rob Reiner for his films, his humor, and his humanity. They admired Michelle Reiner for her poise, her intellect, and her unwavering support of her family. Yet in a single morning, the facade of perfection shattered, revealing a world of hidden tensions, unresolved conflicts, and devastating consequences. The day of horror was not just a crime scene. It was a revelation, exposing the vulnerability and complexity of even the most admired families. Investigators would later detail the meticulous steps they took to reconstruct the scene. Forensic teams combed the estate for evidence, cataloged every item, and examined the property for signs of forced entry or struggle. Interviews with staff, friends, and family provided additional layers of context, revealing a complex web of relationships and interactions. Even as evidence mounted, the narrative retained its air of unpredictability. What had seemed like a straightforward investigation quickly revealed nuances and contradictions, underscoring the depth of the tragedy and the complexity of the Reiner family dynamic. And then there was the public reaction. Social media exploded, mixing grief with fascination, speculation with outrage. Fans of Rob Reiner's films expressed disbelief and sorrow, sharing memories and personal stories about how his work had touched their lives. Others debated potential motives, drawing connections between family tension, mental health, and access to wealth. The story became both intimate and universal, a tragic parable about the vulnerabilities of human relationships, the consequences of unresolved anger, and the fragility of even the most outwardly successful lives. But the most shocking element of all was yet to come. The details surrounding Nick Reiner's actions, his motivations, and the confession that would send shockwaves through the courtroom, the media, and the public consciousness. The day of horror was only the beginning. What investigators uncovered next, what emerged in court proceedings, and what would ultimately define this story were revelations so unsettling that they reshaped the public understanding of the Reiners, their legacy, and the fragile line between love and betrayal. Because in the world of the Reiners, appearances had always been deceiving. Beneath the glamour, the laughter, and the accolades lay a web of tension, conflict, and human frailty. The events of that day exposed it all, leaving the world to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How well do we know those closest to us? How do privilege and expectation intersect with emotion and morality? And, perhaps most chillingly, how could a son, raised with love and opportunity, become the instrument of his parents' destruction? The moment Nick Reiner was placed into custody, the world's perception of the Reiner family shifted irrevocably. No longer were Rob and Michelle Reiner seen solely as celebrated Hollywood figures. Their story had morphed into a narrative of betrayal, tragedy, and shocking familial collapse. To many, the arrest itself was almost incomprehensible. How could a son, raised in privilege, nurtured with love, and given every advantage life could provide, become the accused in the deaths of his own parents? The police had approached the investigation with extreme caution, aware that the stakes were not only legal but profoundly social. A high-profile family, an unprecedented crime, and a media frenzy combined to make the arrest a delicate operation. Authorities confirmed that Nick was taken into custody without incident, but the gravity of the situation was palpable. For investigators, the arrest marked the beginning of an exhaustive inquiry, one that would explore motives, psychological factors, and the sequence of events that had culminated in this unimaginable tragedy. Immediately following his arrest, the public's attention turned to the details of Nick's demeanor and statements. Witnesses and law enforcement officials reported conflicting impressions, at times calm and detached, at other times emotional and visibly shaken. His actions were dissected in real time, analyzed for insight into his state of mind. Questions raced through the media and public alike. Was he remorseful? Was there a rational explanation? Or had years of tension and resentment finally erupted in a moment of uncontrollable rage? The legal process began almost immediately. Attorneys representing Nick prepared to navigate a complex case that involved not only evidence and forensic analysis, but also a deeply emotional narrative. Every interaction, every testimony, every recorded statement would become a piece of the puzzle, scrutinized by investigators, the press, and the public. And while the courts worked to maintain procedural order, the story unfolded simultaneously in living rooms, offices, and online forums, where speculation ran rampant and opinions solidified before facts could fully emerge. Central to the investigation, and to the public's understanding, was the question of motive. What had driven Nick Reiner to allegedly commit an act so violent, so unthinkable, against the very people who had shaped his life? Early reports suggested that long-standing tensions over personal autonomy, financial disagreements, and unresolved emotional conflicts played a role. Friends and insiders hinted at disputes that had escalated over months, perhaps even years. Psychologists would later suggest that a combination of perceived slights, unprocessed anger, and identity struggles could create the psychological conditions for such a catastrophic action. It was during questioning that a critical development occurred: Nick's confession. According to court documents, he provided statements that detailed his involvement in the deaths of his parents. While the legal nuances of these statements would be examined in court, the essence was shocking. The son, the heir to a Hollywood dynasty, admitted to actions that the public could barely comprehend. For law enforcement, the confession was both a breakthrough and a challenge, providing clarity on certain elements while raising further questions about motive, timing, and intent. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Social media erupted, with some expressing horror, others disbelief, and still others a grim fascination with the unfolding story. Headlines dominated news cycles. Nick Reiner confesses, son arrested in Hollywood family tragedy. Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and wife dead, son taken into custody. The combination of fame, family, and crime created an irresistible narrative. Experts in criminal psychology weighed in, analyzing possible triggers, emotional dynamics, and patterns consistent with familial homicide cases. Even casual observers were drawn into the story, debating theories and moral questions that had no easy answers. One of the most compelling aspects of Nick's confession was the insight it provided into the human psyche. Here was a young man, raised in comfort and privilege, whose internal conflicts had reached a breaking point. Investigators noted evidence of both premeditation and emotional volatility. The confession suggested that actions were not purely impulsive but also rooted in accumulated grievances, frustration, and perhaps a distorted perception of injustice. This duality, a mixture of deliberate decision-making and uncontrolled emotional reaction, added a layer of complexity to the case, challenging simplistic narratives of good and evil. Family dynamics, always central to this tragedy, were illuminated in new ways through the confession. Nick's statements revealed not only disputes over tangible matters such as money and autonomy, but also deeper emotional fractures. Feelings of inadequacy, resentment, and perceived neglect had festered over time, transforming ordinary family disagreements into a storm of destructive emotion. The confession allowed investigators and the public to see these dynamics in stark relief, underscoring the notion that even families that appear perfect on the surface can harbor hidden tensions with devastating potential. As the legal proceedings advanced, courtroom observers noted the interplay between emotion and accountability. The defense, while acknowledging the confession, began exploring mitigating factors, including mental health, stress, and family context. Prosecutors focused on the gravity of the act, the premeditation, and the breach of trust inherent in a child harming their parents. Every hearing became a microcosm of larger societal questions. What drives a person to such extremes? How do privilege, expectation, and emotion intersect to create catastrophe? And what does justice look like when familial love is shattered so violently? Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified, turning Nick Reiner into a figure of both infamy and fascination. Analysts debated his personality, psychological profile, and possible motivations. Former colleagues and friends of the family offered insights into the Reiner household, describing patterns of behavior, communication breakdowns, and unspoken tensions that may have contributed to the tragedy. The combination of celebrity, crime, and personal betrayal created a story that was impossible to ignore, one that demanded attention, analysis, and reflection. Nick's confession also sparked conversations about societal expectations and the pressures of growing up in the public eye. Children of famous parents face unique challenges: the weight of legacy, constant comparison, and the struggle to define one's identity independent of familial reputation. In Nick's case, these pressures, combined with personal and emotional turmoil, may have contributed to a chain of events that ultimately culminated in tragedy. Psychologists and criminologists studying the case pointed to the importance of early intervention, emotional support, and mental health resources, lessons that resonate far beyond the confines of the Reiner family story. And yet, even as the confession clarified some elements of the case, it left others shrouded in mystery. Investigators continued to probe the timeline, examine evidence, and verify statements. Questions about the exact sequence of events, the triggers for the act, and the interplay between premeditation and impulse remained. For the public, this uncertainty fueled speculation, debate, and a macabre fascination with the unfolding drama. Every revelation prompted new questions, and every question seemed to lead to deeper, darker territory. In the courtroom, the weight of the confession was palpable. Friends and family, members of the media, and legal professionals alike struggled to process the reality of the situation. This was not a fictional story, nor a dramatization for film or television. It was real life, with real consequences and real heartbreak. The confession illuminated the fragility of human relationships and the destructive potential of unresolved conflict. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about family, privilege, and the sometimes devastating consequences of emotional turmoil left unchecked. But as shocking as the arrest and confession were, they were only the beginning. The days that followed would reveal further twists, deeper insights into the Reiner family dynamics, and the legal maneuvering that would define Nick Reiner's fate. The confession had opened a door, but behind it lay even darker revelations, questions of accountability, and an unraveling of a family legacy that had once seemed untouchable. When news of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths and the arrest of their son Nick broke, Hollywood did what it often does in the face of shock. It reacted loudly and emotionally. But this reaction wasn't just about gossip or headline-grabbing commentary. It was a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, speculation, and, in some corners, subtle judgment. After all, the Reiners were Hollywood royalty. Rob Reiner had not just created films, he had shaped culture. His influence on the film industry, the careers he launched, and the iconic movies he directed were legendary. And Michelle Reiner, often understated in public, had been an anchor, a confidant, and a force in her own right. Their deaths, at the hands of their own child, rocked Hollywood to its core. The initial reactions poured in on social media platforms, interviews, and talk shows. Actors who had worked with Rob Reiner shared memories, some humorous, some deeply personal. They recounted moments on set that highlighted his humanity, his commitment to storytelling, and his ability to bring out the best in those around him. Directors, producers, and writers echoed similar sentiments, describing him as a mentor and a friend, someone whose advice could change careers overnight. The shock was not just that of losing two beloved individuals. It was the shock that someone so familiar with compassion, creativity, and human connection could be the victim of such a horrific act within their own home. Colleagues and peers expressed disbelief that Nick Reiner, the only child of Rob and Michelle, could commit such a crime. In Hollywood, children of famous families are often scrutinized, but rarely in such an extreme and tragic way. Commentators debated whether Nick's upbringing in privilege, fame, and expectation had contributed to the tension that led to this unthinkable act. Was it a case of entitlement gone wrong, a psychological breakdown under pressure, or a combination of both? These discussions dominated panels, podcasts, and celebrity interviews, each offering a slightly different lens on the tragedy. Among the reactions, there were also those that politicized the event. One of the most widely discussed statements came from former President Donald Trump, who criticized Rob Reiner on social media, suggesting, without evidence, that the deaths were linked to the anger he had caused others through his vocal criticism of Trump. While this claim was baseless, it added a combustible element to the public discourse. The tragedy was no longer just a story of family collapse. It had become a lightning rod for political debate, partisanship, and social commentary. The blend of crime, fame, and politics created an irresistible story for both traditional media and online platforms, ensuring that it remained a top conversation piece for weeks. But Hollywood's reaction was not solely performative. Many actors, directors, and crew members who had worked with Rob Reiner privately mourned, sharing stories of kindness, mentorship, and unforgettable moments. One veteran actor recounted a scene on the set of Misery where Reiner went out of his way to ensure every crew member was included in a celebratory dinner, showing that his compassion extended beyond the lens of fame. Others spoke of his advocacy for social causes, his generosity in supporting struggling filmmakers, and the genuine interest he took in fostering talent. This humanized side of Rob Reiner made the tragedy even more poignant. The contrast between a man who had touched so many lives positively and the violent fate he met within his own home was impossible to ignore. Michelle Reiner's impact, while less publicized, was also recognized. Friends described her as the quiet power behind the household, the person who managed family dynamics with care, grace, and wisdom. She had been instrumental in navigating the challenges of fame, from schooling to social events, and her influence had extended beyond the home into philanthropic endeavors and community engagement. The loss of Michelle added another layer of sorrow, highlighting that this was not only a crime but the destruction of a family unit that had long been admired for its composure and cohesion. Media outlets also delved into Rob Reiner's filmography, drawing contrasts between the warmth and morality depicted in his movies and the stark, tragic reality of his personal life. Critics and fans alike noted the irony that a man who often explored themes of loyalty, love, and human connection on screen would be so violently affected by fractures in his own family. It became a cultural touchpoint. Discussions of Rob Reiner's work were now inseparably linked with the story of his family's collapse, blending art, life, and tragedy in ways few could have predicted. Hollywood insiders speculated endlessly about Nick's upbringing and the dynamics that led to the tragedy. Was there a history of mental health struggles? Did the pressures of growing up in the shadow of a legend contribute to a sense of inadequacy or resentment? Could this have been prevented with intervention or counseling? These questions, while complex, fueled ongoing dialogue across entertainment circles, academic forums, and public commentary. Experts weighed in on the psychology of children raised in fame, noting that privilege does not inoculate against emotional turmoil, identity crises, or moral breakdowns. Nick's actions became a case study in how hidden familial tensions, unaddressed psychological challenges, and unresolved anger can combine with catastrophic results. The story also highlighted Hollywood's fascination with morality tales. Here was a family whose outward image had been one of stability, creativity, and respectability, now reduced to a narrative of betrayal, crime, and scandal. Public interest was insatiable. Documentaries were proposed, feature articles published, and social media threads dissected every known detail. The Reiner tragedy became a prism through which Hollywood examined itself. The pressures of fame, the fragility of reputation, and the human vulnerabilities lurking behind the glossy surface of celebrity life. Yet amidst the shock and speculation, there were moments of genuine reflection. Colleagues emphasized the need to honor the legacy of Rob and Michelle Reiner. They encouraged audiences to remember the humanity, talent, and compassion that defined their lives, even as the horrific circumstances of their deaths dominated headlines. In interviews, some stressed the importance of separating the actions of one individual, Nick, from the enduring impact of the parents' lives and contributions. This balancing act between mourning, analysis, and ethical responsibility became a recurring theme in Hollywood's reaction. At the same time, the story fueled a broader cultural conversation about family dynamics, mental health, and the consequences of unresolved tension. Psychologists, social workers, and legal analysts discussed warning signs that often precede familial violence, noting that early intervention, open communication, and mental health support can be crucial in preventing tragedy. Nick Reiner's actions, while shocking, served as a grim reminder of the importance of addressing emotional conflicts, particularly in households under the stress of fame, wealth, and public scrutiny. The media frenzy also included retrospectives of Rob Reiner's most iconic works. From the heartfelt coming-of-age story in Stand By Me to the comedic brilliance of This Is Spinal Tap, journalists highlighted how his films often explored complex human relationships, morality, and emotional growth. The tragic irony of a family narrative ending in real-life violence added an unsettling dimension to these retrospectives, blurring the line between art and life. Audience reactions were equally varied. Some mourned the personal loss, others analyzed the irony, and a few used the tragedy to question broader societal and familial structures. And then there was the court of public opinion. Social media, forums, and comment sections exploded with analysis, debate, and speculation. Many were quick to condemn Nick, framing him as the embodiment of entitlement and moral failure. Others expressed sympathy, attempting to contextualize his actions within psychological frameworks, family dynamics, or the pressures of growing up in fame. The intensity of public scrutiny added pressure to legal proceedings, amplified emotional responses, and ensured that the tragedy remained in the public eye, not merely as a crime, but as a cultural touchstone reflecting the complexities of family, fame, and morality. Yet despite the outrage, fascination, and debate, Hollywood's core reaction remained rooted in grief. Rob Reiner's peers, friends, and collaborators mourned the loss of a creative giant and a kind-hearted human being. Michelle Reiner's friends lamented the loss of a quiet, strong, and stabilizing presence in their lives. The community struggled to reconcile the violent act of one individual with the enduring legacies of two remarkable people. And in that struggle, Hollywood and the world began to grapple with the profound lessons embedded in this tragedy. The fragility of relationships, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the devastating consequences of unresolved emotional conflict. The arrest of Nick Reiner was only the beginning. In the days following the tragedy, law enforcement launched an exhaustive investigation into the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner, determined to uncover not only what happened, but how and why. In a case of this magnitude, involving a high-profile family, the scrutiny was intense. Every detail mattered, from forensic evidence to digital footprints, witness statements to financial records. The investigation was meticulous, methodical, and relentless, a process that would reveal layers of complexity far beyond what the public initially imagined. Investigators began by securing the Reiner estate. Crime scene units swept through every room, carefully documenting evidence, taking photographs, and cataloging items that might shed light on the events leading up to the tragedy. Even objects that seemed mundane were examined under microscopes and forensically tested. Every surface, every corner, every interaction within the home was a potential clue. Forensic specialists noted the lack of forced entry, suggesting that the suspect had access to the house. A detail that, in retrospect, aligned with the shocking revelation that the accused was none other than the Reiner's son. The investigation also delved deeply into digital evidence. Phones, emails, social media accounts, and personal devices were examined for messages, conversations, or digital footprints that could indicate motive or intent. Investigators scrutinized text exchanges and email threads, searching for signs of escalating conflict, threats, or unusual behavior in the days and weeks before the deaths. Analysts noted patterns of tension and unresolved grievances, painting a picture of a household rife with private conflicts, some of which had remained hidden from friends, colleagues, and the public eye. Financial records were another critical component. As with many families of substantial means, questions regarding access to funds, inheritance, and property were inevitable. Investigators examined bank statements, investment accounts, and other financial documents to understand any potential stress.